Welcome to Cal Poly Pomona's URP 3350 class, Plan Making, History, and Future. Today's presentation is going to be on the California General Plan Guidelines. My name is Professor Scott Reimers. In the state of California, a general plan is required for all counties and all cities. That general plan needs to include not just a plan for that city, but also for its sphere of influences. And a sphere of influence is a section of county that is unincorporated and that might be incorporated by the city just in terms of geography. Even if the city doesn't have any plan to incorporate that area, because it's within proximity to a city, the city has to plan for that. And so the city will include in its land use diagram land uses for each of those. So the general plan has to include the land in the city, the land in the sphere of influence. It's a document that envisions what the future is going to be like in terms of the physical development of that city. The state talks about the general plan acting as a charter that a zoning ordinance has to conform to. So the general plan sets the vision, the goals, the objectives that then plug into the zoning code. And so there has to be consistency between that general plan and the zoning ordinance. And that general plan process should start with a community visioning process. So the community sits down and thinks about, what do we want to be when we grow up? What do we want to be in 20 or 30 years from now? And then based on that, the city develops a sets of goals, objectives, and policies. Now, another goal of the general plan is to align itself, local agencies, with state goals. And some of the state goals that are mentioned is to promote infill development. And the benefit of that is that it makes building infrastructure more efficient, to protect the natural and working lands, to develop efficiently, so limiting sprawl, minimizing taxpayer cost, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so those are the state goals. Those are what local agencies need to do in order to partner and plan for those state goals. The general plan guidelines also talk about the purpose of a general plan as guiding land use planning decisions. So that means that when a planning commission or a city council makes land use decisions, it needs to make sure that those land use decisions are based on the general plan and conform with the general plan. So whether a planning commission is approving a conditional use permit or is approving a development in a hillside development zone, or whether the city council is changing the zoning map, all of those need to be consistent with that general plan. So we talked about the purpose of the general plan, what it's supposed to be doing, how it acts at the local level. Now I want to talk about what's in the general plan. The general plan is made up of a number of different, what the state calls elements. And elements at their most basic levels are just pieces. So there's many different pieces to a general plan. Because these documents are typically printed paper documents, people often think of them as chapters. So when you're talking to the public, you might want to call them a land use chapter or a noise chapter. But in the general plan guidelines, you'll see them referred to as elements. So these are basically the topics that are covered in your general plan. Now, there is no maximum number that you can have. You can talk about all the different types of elements that you want to talk about, but there is a certain number. There are 9 elements that you have to cover. There's no order or structure to them. You don't have to do land use first. You don't have to do circulation second. You could turn it around. You could put them last. There's any type of order you want to them. And there's no structure. It's not as if the land use sits above them all and then one sits below it. Because what the state law says is that they all have the same legal standing, meaning they're all equal. You can't say that the land use element is more important than the circulation element. They're all equal. There must be consistency between these different general plan elements. You can't have one saying one thing and one another, which is why sometimes cities will go and do a whole comprehensive general plan update. The elements can be combined. They can be renamed. In Temple City, we did just that. We combined a few elements to create kind of a more consistent framework. Or you could rename them if under the general plan guidelines, we use the term circulation, but more and more often we're seeing that cities call it mobility. It's important to recognize that each element affects or should at least affect the other element. So what you say in the land use element, it really is going to change what happens in the air quality element. The mobility element is going to, or circulation element is going to affect what happens in your noise element and your air quality element. So in that way they interact. And at that point, it's also important that there is consistency between them. So where you plan for growth in the land use element, that should affect your mobility element. And where you plan for growth in your land use element should affect your conservation element. Where you propose to build out larger streets, that's going to affect your noise element or your air quality element. So now let's kind of turn the page now that we talked about elements in general, and let's talk about each of the mandatory elements. So as I mentioned, in the general plan guidelines and under state law, there are currently 9 general plan elements. This is the winter of 2023. So those, the first one that we're going to talk about is the land use element. The land use element talks about the type, the intensity, and the distribution of land uses. Type, intensity, and distribution. So type of land uses is whether it's going to be residential, whether it's going to be mixed use, whether it's going to be commercial or industrial or open space or public uses. What type of uses are you going to allow in this district? Intensity. So here's where you're going to put how intensive is that land use? Is it single family residential? Is it multifamily residential? Are you going to allow an FAR of 0.25 or 0.5 or 1.0 or even higher? So that's what we're talking about typically when we talk about intensity. You might have in your industrial designation, you might have kind of low scale industrial and more like manufacturing. In terms of public open space, you might combine that with public facilities and open space, and then you might have 2 different types of designation. And then how are you going to distribute that? And that's pretty clear. You're going to show the type and intensity on a land use diagram. Note, we don't call it a map in terms of the general plan. It's not like a zoning map. This is a land use diagram. So we're diagramming out where each of these different land uses should be in the future and how intense they will be. And so again, this distribution includes the issues of housing, business, industry, open space, public uses. Those are the more common things you're going to see on that land use diagram. So the next required general plan element is the circulation element. Often this is reframed as the mobility element. This should be intertwined with your land use element. So typically when cities are not doing a comprehensive general plan update, it's because they're either doing a housing element or it's because they're updating the land use element with the mobility element or the circulation element. Because how you plan for growth in the land use element should affect how you're going to provide the ability to circulate or move around in the physical environment. So do you need to build out some arterials? Do you need to plan for bicycle movements? Do you need to plan for transit based on where you're growing? So this element is going to include both existing and proposed roads. It's going to classify the roads between arterials, local streets, and so forth. You're going to show on there not just how people get around, but also how goods get around. So you're going to have things like airports and harbors and railroad tracks and truck routes and things like that. So that's all in that circulation element. So the next element, these are kind of the top 3, land use, circulation, and housing. The housing element looks at both the current and the future housing need. It's both current and future housing need. It looks at the community needs in terms of all segments of that community. That's a big push under the housing element is how are you going to provide affordable housing? How are you going to provide housing for special groups that might need it? In Temple City, for instance, we have a large group of seniors who are equity rich, meaning their houses are worth or their land is worth a lot, but they have very little day-to-day income. And so that was a particular thing that we needed to look at in our housing element was how are we going to provide for that specific segment. So you can look at the characteristics of the existing population and the existing housing stock. Often in infill cities, you might find that the housing stock is in really poor shape and that you might need to have programs in place to help people fix up their homes and do code enforcement and so forth. You're going to talk about accomplishments since the last housing element. What has the city done in order to perform on the last housing element? And then the main push, and you see it when you start looking at the land use element and the circulation element, you see that the housing elements are typically set up very differently. And that a big piece of the housing element is the implementation. What are the programs you're going to put in place to meet these needs? And so you'll see that a lot of information is put into the appendices of your housing element, and then most of the housing element, then the most of the paper is spent on talking about those programs. Now, this is one of the few elements of the general plan that is required to be reviewed by a state organization, and it's the only element that has to be certified by the state. And so when you're done proposing your general plan to the city council would typically review it, and then it's sent to and approve it, and then it's sent to the State Housing Community Development Department to be certified. And then sometimes the HCD will have some revisions, and then it has to come back to city council for those revisions. This is also the only element that requires, that must by state law be updated. Typically, that's an 8-year update. If the city hasn't performed in certain ways, then it can be a 5-year update. The next mandatory element is regarding conservation. This is not just conservation, but it's also conservation, development, and use of all your natural resources. So this is going to include things like bodies of water. It's going to include your forest, your soils, your rivers, and your mineral deposits. And in Pasadena, we combine this element, for instance, conservation with open space, because your conservation areas tend to also be open space areas. And so we combined this element and the next element. So the open space element is an element that focuses on kind of long-range preservation and conservation of these open space lands. So you're talking about how you're going to preserve this area, how you're going to manage production if it's more agriculture or forest-based land. And then this is where you're also going to talk about your outdoor recreational areas. The noise element is an element that's tied a lot to the land use element. It's also tied to mobility or circulation, because where you place new growth in terms of land uses like manufacturing, that's going to have a major impact on noise, but it's also very much tied to circulation. So where do you have a lot of vehicles driving through? Do you have an airport or a heliport? Do you have freeways? Do you have train tracks? A lot of those are areas that create noise. And so we often see the noise element tied very closely with the mobility or circulation element. So you might want to think about when you're updating your land use element, where do you have noise issues? And then plan future growth away from those noise areas. Similarly, with your mobility element, you might want to think about placing growth away from areas that have significant noise issues. The safety element is looks at all different types of topics. It will include seismic hazards, so it will show you where all your closest fault zones are. It will include geological hazards like mudslides, liquefaction areas, subsidence areas. If you have a river nearby, you're often going to have liquefaction areas. Liquefaction is when during an earthquake, the soil becomes almost like liquid. So you can imagine that's going to create some major structural issues. And so in terms of construction of your buildings, you're going to want to make sure that they take into account those liquefaction risks. Subsidence is when the ground is the ground is actually falling in elevation because so much water is being taken out due to pumping of groundwater. So that often is an issue in the Central Valley of California. There's also, in terms of safety, you'll be looking at areas that flood. So again, often typically areas that are very flat, or areas that have rivers. You have your wildfire hazard areas. So we have a lot of wildfire hazard areas along the mountains where there's forest. Often this is also in your hillside areas. Drought issues in California are sometimes covered in your safety element. And then if you have beach communities, you might be looking at concerns regarding saltwater intrusion. So that's when your saltwater starts to get into your groundwater system. And then also might be where you would put things like issues dealing with climate change and climate adaptation. So the environmental justice chapter, that's the latest chapter that's been added to the California general plan requirements. So we're seeing and watching this grow and getting more understanding of what should be in there and what cities are doing in response. In terms of environmental justice, the guidelines talk about covering subjects such as reducing people's exposure to pollution, improving air quality, promoting public facilities, improving access to food. So you have heard of that idea of food deserts. This would improve that. Advancing access to housing and increasing physical activity. And then the last section is the air quality chapter or air quality element. This is a section that would look at how do we reduce impacts of air quality and the city's air quality emissions. So in general, just a note that there's 3 different types of air quality. There's point sources, and those are fixed stationary points that create air quality emissions. So if you have like a large manufacturing plant or a quarry that kicks up a lot of dust, that's going to be a point source. A non-point source is small facilities that on their own don't create a really significant impact on air quality. And so that might be like a gas station or a dry cleaner. But cumulatively together, all of these gas stations, all of these dry cleaners do create a significant impact. So that's a non-point source. So you have point, non-point, and then you have mobile sources. And so that's easily understood as airplanes, trains, cars, and so forth. So those were all the mandatory elements. Now the cities have the opportunity of also adopting optional elements. And some common ones that we tend to see are community health elements, elements focused entirely on equity. Sustainability is kind of one that when it originally came out, people didn't know what to do with it, and there's still quite some debate about it. Should you have one element that talks about the issue of environmental sustainability or social equity, or should you put a little bit of those sustainability issues throughout every single chapter? So that's one thing to consider. Economic development is a common optional element. Resiliency, education, also historic preservation. These are all some optional elements that cities may choose to adopt depending on what's important within their community. As I mentioned earlier, cities can then take all these both optional elements and the mandatory elements and organize them however they want. So for instance, in Temple City, when we did a comprehensive general plan update, we had the typical land use element, mobility element, but then the next element was economic development. And then following that, we grouped elements together. So we have a community services element that incorporates public facilities, community facilities, arts and culture, education, public safety, recreation and open space, and utilities. So that you can tell includes some of those mandatory elements, like open space. And then there's another chapter, community services. There's another chapter, natural resources. Natural resources includes air quality and climate, natural environment, and water resources. And then the last element that Temple City has is a hazards element. And so that includes a lot of the safety issues, but it's been renamed hazards. So it includes fire, flooding, hazardous waste and materials, noise, seismic issues, and wind. The city once had a major windstorm that caused a lot of issues in the community, and so they wanted to make sure that was included in their safety element or their hazards element. So now I want to talk to you about the criteria of what needs to be in a good general plan. So we've talked about the different elements, the different chapters, but now how does it actually function together, and what is the criteria of a good one? So we're going to go over a number of different elements here. The first one is it needs to be comprehensive. And so state law and the general plan guidelines talk about the general plan needing to cover the entire planning area. That means your entire city. If your city includes a sphere of influence, then it also needs to plan for that sphere of influence. And it doesn't need to be just geographically comprehensive. It also needs to include all the major issues that are in that community. And so that's a broad range from the 9 required elements of the general plan to even potentially those optional elements. And then it also needs to include links to both regional plans and other local plans you might have, like a climate action plan. So it should reference some of the goals set in the sustainable communities strategy of your county or planning organization. And if you have a specific plan that you're keeping, it should reflect those, and it should also reflect the state's major efforts in terms of planning. The second is it needs to be geographically comprehensive, and that means it needs to cover the entire city or county. So as I had mentioned, it needs to be include those spheres of influences. So again, the sphere of influence is an area of a county that has not yet been incorporated into a city. So these are unincorporated areas. And so sometimes those areas are divided into smaller pockets, and then one pocket of that unincorporated area is planned for by one city and another pocket is planned for by another city. And so the cities basically have to go through an exercise of thinking to themselves, if we did end up annexing this area into our community, annexing meaning to take it into our community, what would the general plan designation for that area be? The county has an even bigger job, and that's they need to consider not just their general plan, but they also need to consider the general plans of all the cities that are within its boundary. Another criteria for a general plan is the regional context. A city or an agency needs to understand the regional perspective that's being planned for. And so in the SCAG region, we would look at the RTP, we would look at the SCS. And so we would look at what is the region and the state planning for in terms of transportation, energy production, what are the climate change goals, what's the air quality issues in that region, what are the water supply issues, floodplain issues. All of these are issues that not necessarily relate to city boundaries. Floodplains don't stop at one city boundary or another. Air quality doesn't change depending on where a city boundary is. So one needs to understand where the different floodplains are, where the different bodies of water are. They need to understand like what role does the South Coast Air Quality Management District play and what are their plans in terms of air quality. And so the local agency needs to be planning with these regional entities. In Southern California, we would be looking towards the Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG, and looking at their SCS, or their Sustainable Community Strategy. From the state level, we would be looking at the housing need for our community. Now, that starts at the state level, and then the state assigns a housing allocation to each municipal planning organization, in our case, SCAG. And then SCAG gives each city its regional housing needs assessment. And so we need to, as a city, plan for that RHNA, or regional housing needs assessment. And then we may need to update our general plan whenever there are major changes happening in another city, or when a major regional planning change occurs. So for instance, when we receive new RHNA numbers, we have to update our general plan. And sometimes that's not just the housing element, it's also the land use element. If a new city or county is building a large infrastructure project and is planning for a major large community that's going to take access through your local community, you may want to update your general plan accordingly. Your plan also needs to be comprehensive in terms of issues. So it needs to address a very broad range of issues. It needs to focus on issues specifically relevant to its planning area. So if your community has, strong concerns about education, then you may want to include a section or an element on education. It's important to address the physical development of that city, though, in terms of mix, timing, and amount of land use and infrastructure. And land use decisions may have the following impacts that should be considered. They may have environmental impacts, they may have social impacts or economic impacts. And so you need to understand the full breadth of not just deciding what land use should be there, but understanding what are the impacts of those land use decisions. Are there going to be environmental impacts? If so, plan for those. If there's going to be social or economic impacts, those all need to be handled. Those are all issues that need to be handled in order to be considered comprehensive. So state law uses the term consistency, and it says that the document needs to be consistent internally. And that means no policy should conflict with another policy, with any other text, with any other diagrams, that the policies all need to be balanced and reconciled together. So within the document, it's consistent. So state law also says that each element of the general plan has equal status. And an example of this is when the Sierra Club sued the County Board of Supervisors in Kern. And in that case, what that demonstrated was there was one land use being showed on a specific property. So this specific property was supposed to have had one land use designation. But then when you looked at the open space element, that showed a different use for that land. So the land use element did not have the same land use designation as the open space element. But the Kern County planners thought they could satisfy the internal consistency issue by just saying in the text that if there is any inconsistency, then the land use element overrules the open space element. But what the Court of Appeals said was that this violated that equal status provision. You can't say, well, if there's any room for interpretation, look at the land use element and that will rule, because that creates an issue of equal status. There's a broader conversation in the general plan guidelines that talks about consistency, and it talks about 4 different instances of consistency. And the first is consistency between the elements. So the land use element needs to be consistent with the mobility element. The land use element needs to be consistent with the housing element. So within them, there needs to be consistency. So if your land use elements expects an increase in population and you're planning for that in terms of land use designations, but your circulation element doesn't plan for any change in the population, then your housing element, then you don't have consistency between those two elements. Your housing element update law does require that your land use element also has to be updated if there's a large enough amount of growth in your housing element and the housing element can't account for that growth. So what we saw in the most recent housing element update was that a lot of cities didn't have the capacity in their land use element to meet their RHNA allotments or assessments. So a lot of cities ended up in their housing element update needing to also update their land use element and upzone some areas. And then that way they could create consistency between those two elements. So the first is consistency between the elements. The second is consistency within the element. So within the land use element, everything needs to be consistent. And so that means the data in there, the analysis, the goals, the policies, the implementation, all of that's going to be internally consistent. So if your circulation element expected an increase in population and congestion, and then states that congestion should be reduced, but then includes an LOS standard of F, allowing intersections to fail, someone can make an argument that that is not consistency. In order to create consistency, if you have a policy that says congestion should be reduced, then you should have probably a different LOS standard, or you should have or you should update that policy so that it says that congestion doesn't need to be addressed, but you've got to create consistency within that. The third is area plan consistency, and that's just stating that an area plan needs to be consistent with the general plan. The general plan needs to discuss the role of that area plan. And then also not just area plan consistency, but also climate action plans. If you have one, then the guidelines and state law says that should be consistent with the general plan. State law does note that if a city doesn't have funds to cover the update to the general plan, that they can do those updates in the next general plan update. And then lastly, so we've got consistency between the elements, consistency within the elements, area plan consistency, and the last is text and diagram consistency. And that just means that all of your text and all of your diagrams or maps need to be consistent with each other. So if you have text that says we're going to preserve our agricultural regions, but then your land use diagram shows an area that's currently agriculture and it's going to change to single family residential, that's an inconsistency and that needs to be changed. And then the last criteria that we want to look at is that long-term perspective. A general plan needs to have a very long-term perspective. What's long-term? That's the problem. And the guidelines are pretty clear about long-term the meaning of that is variable. And it might depend on the subject that you're talking about. So your housing element, for instance, has to be updated either every 5 or 8 years. That doesn't seem long-term in relationship, for instance, to infrastructure, which is sometimes designed for a 30 to 50-year period. If you have an economic development chapter, you may end up needing to update that quite often because economic trends change very often. So depending on the subject that you're talking about, your long-term perspective may be drastically different. Now, in general, your goals tend to be very long-term driven, and then your objectives and your policies tend to be shorter and shorter, and then your implementation measures are even shorter than that. So, so that as you start fulfilling these policies, you start making movement towards long-term objectives and goals. Most agencies pick kind of a 20-year time horizon. That seems to be the most common threshold. But for instance, if the state adopted policies for climate change 30 years from now, then you would probably pick maybe a 30-year time horizon for updating your air quality element. So that pretty much wraps it up for today's lecture. We've talked about the purpose of the general plan according to state law and the general plan guidelines. We went over all the different mandatory elements: land use, circulation, housing, open space, conservation, noise, safety, environmental justice, and air quality. We went over some different typical optional elements. What are some different ways of setting up those general plan elements, and if you wanted to combine them, and then went through the different criteria for a good general plan. So with your remaining time, please look up the California General Plan Mapping Tool and spend some time for the rest of this lecture looking at your city that you've chosen for your project, and then turn on the different layers, get a sense for what those different layers are and how you might plan different goals, objectives, and policies in relation to the different things that are on there. You're going to find that there's tools in relation to land use, things related to your safety element in terms of flood hazard areas. It'll show different open space areas within there. It'll show the different fault zones. So take a look, play around with that, and enjoy.